Well, I want to welcome you to this, the third week in the season of Epiphany. We've been given a real gift because our lectionary psalm is Psalm 19. Most of the great composers, Bach, Beethoven, Handel, and Haydn, all utilized this psalm in some context in their musical compositions. C.S. Lewis, too, declared this psalm to be the treasure trove of all the psalms. He said, "I take this to be the greatest poem in the Psalter, one of the greatest lyrics in all the world." Now, I should say that some scholars believe that this psalm is actually a composite, that is, a joining of two hymns or psalms together, one being a hymn of creation from verses 1 through 6, and then the other being a hymn to God's Torah, or the law, in verses 7 through 10. And then it ends with the psalmist's own prayer in verses 11 through 14. Well, if they were a joining together of two different psalms or hymns, then their joining would be probably one of the most natural and most necessary, kind of like the bonding of hydrogen to oxygen to form water, which is the substance of life. But I think the way the psalm begins with a focus on creation and then progressively narrows to the Son and then to the law and then to the individual, I see this as all one psalm, and I would agree then with Lewis that this is one majestic poem with a unifying theme of God being revealed to us. And I think every line in this psalm contains some reference to it. We begin in verse 1, the heavens tell the glory of God. The skies display his marvelous craftsmanship. It says, day after day they continue to speak. Night after night they make him known. So we have these words that express reference to how God is revealing himself to us. Our study for today, if you have a Bible handy, I would really encourage you to get it and open it to Psalm 19. The first 6 verses for us are the psalm that deals with creation. The heavens proclaim the glory of God, the skies display his craftsmanship, and day after day they continue to speak, and night after night they continue to make him known. The psalmist begins with creation, perhaps for the same reason that our Bible begins with creation. We were made in the image of God. We are the culmination of God's great creation. But sin mars the human creation. And so it was because of that sin that God, in his marvelous grace, sends the beloved Son to come. And through Christ, we experience this whole new recreation, which is probably just as amazing as the first creation. But now we are remade so that we can be in right relationship with the Creator once again. But of course, the Bible also tells us about the fact that there is a day coming when everything that God created, not only us, but all of our world, will be restored. Paul says that in Romans, that for all creation is waiting eagerly for that future day when God will be revealed. Against its will, all creation was subjected to God's curse. But in eager hope, the creation now looks forward to the day when it will join God's children in glorious freedom from death and decay. Now we know that all creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to this present time. And we as believers also groan, even though we have the Holy Spirit within us as a foretaste of the future glory which we long for. So we too wait with eager hope for that day when God will give us our full rights as adopted children. That's in Romans chapter 8. And so that's why I believe God's story begins with creation and it ends with creation being glorified. And I think Christian theology, whether it's soteriology, whether it's Christology or eschatology, whatever it is, it all needs to be grounded in this concept of creation. And so that's why the psalmist begins, first of all, by reflecting on how all of God's creation reveals God's glory. You know, often we can look at the flowers and the beauty of the skies and the night sky with its twinkling stars, and yesterday with its huge dump of snow, it's now all glistening and white in the sunshine. All of these things speak to our inner being about the glory and the majesty of creation. There's not words to express it. And perhaps that's what the psalmist is trying to express when he says they speak without sound or word. And yet their voice is never heard, and yet their message goes throughout the earth and all the words to the world. So this is where he begins. Begins with this cosmic glorifying of God. But then he narrows his focus just a little bit, and he focuses on one aspect of God's creation, and that is the sun. In the second part of verse 4, he says, the sun lives in the heavens where God placed it. It bursts forth like a radiant bridegroom after his wedding. It rejoices like a great athlete, eager to run the race. The sun rises at one end of the heavens and follows its course to the other end, and nothing can hide from its heat. Well, it's a well-known fact that the Canaanite, the Babylonians, and many other Near Eastern religions worshipped sun gods. And it may appear that what the psalmist has done here is adapted some of their own hymns of praise and redirected it to praise the one who created the sun in the first place. And so while they may worship what is created, the psalmist says we need to look further than that to the one who created. And I know others have criticized this psalm because it's not scientific. We know that the sun doesn't journey across the heavens, but we also know that the sun doesn't rise or set, but yet we use those terms in a very poetic way. I think that's exactly what the psalmist is doing here. The psalmist's intent is to show that even the sun, as it rises and sets, if we want to use those terms, runs across the heavens in its course because that is what the Creator dictated it to do. And this is just another way of showing an example of how God appears in creation and cares for creation and cares for us. Paul says ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and the sky, and through everything God has made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing about God. But you see, it's not just enough to know about God. God doesn't want just the knowledge of, I know it's like looking at a picture, and we can discern a little bit about the artist from the picture, but we can't really know the artist unless we have an opportunity of sitting down and discussing with them and getting to know them a little bit. And that's exactly what God has sought to do. God wasn't content for us simply to look at God's creation, but God wanted an intimate relationship with us. And that's why God inspires men to write profound truths and have them recorded in our sacred scriptures. And like the sun, God's divinely inspired words bring light and life and penetrate every area of human life. For the psalmist says, the instructions of the Lord are perfect, reviving the soul. The decrees of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The commands of the Lord are right, bringing joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are clear, giving insight for living. Reverence for the Lord is pure, lasting, and forever. And the laws of the Lord are true. Each one is fair, and they're more desirable than gold, even the finest of gold. And they're sweeter than honey, even honey dripping from the comb. And they are a warning to your servant and a great reward for those who obey them. As Christians, we understand the Bible to be much more than a book of do's and don'ts. But while the scriptures contain that more complete revelation of God, God's ultimate disclosure came in the incarnate Son of God, when Jesus was born a babe in Bethlehem. He came in order that he might live with us and show us how we might live. And this leads the psalmist then to pray, "Cleanse me from hidden faults, and keep your servant from deliberate sins, and don't let them control me. And then I will be free of guilt and innocent of great sin." The psalmist identifies two kinds of sin here. The kinds that are hidden, may not even be aware of them, but they are maybe through our thoughtlessness or our busyness, sins that we unconsciously commit. Because sin is so woven into our lives, we don't even sometimes know we are breaking God's rules and desires for us in the way that we live. And when there's also the willful sins. Sometimes we know what we should do, but we don't want to do it. Or in that case, it's because of our stubborn, willful sinfulness. Against both of these kinds of sin, both unknown and known, we are helpless to atone, to make right, to undo what we've done. And that means our only hope is in God, that God will indeed be the one that will deliver us from our own faults and failings, which is the very purpose for which Jesus came, in order that through his righteousness we might be made right with God. And as the author of Hebrews said, we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who's been tempted in every way just as we are, and yet he did not sin. Let's then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our times of need. And then the psalmist brings this beautiful psalm to a close with some beloved and memorized words that encapsulate the psalmist's orientation to God. He asks, "May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer." I think in this prayer, the psalmist brings it all together. He talks about creation, and now he wants to be part of that creation that glorifies God in everything that he says and does. And so this is the petition of Psalm 19. And it's no wonder, I think, that thousands of preachers have, as they approach the sacred desk, offered these words of prayer before they began to share what God had given to them to speak. But I would suggest that it's a prayer that's not just for preachers before they preach, but a prayer that all of us should be willing and ready to pray at any time. I think it'd be a good thing to do to pray this prayer at least once before you call it the end of a day. And as you do, I'm sure that the words will reflect once again that holy desire to be right with him. And since we've actually prayed as we have gone through this prayer in our study time, let's simply now just join our hearts and voices together in the prayer that Christ taught his disciples to pray as one. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. I'm going to have to finish my coffee. I hope you've had time to enjoy a bit of coffee with me in this study time. We look forward to the next time we can be together. Until then, you take good care and be safe.